Welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Barber, author, former IT director for a Fortune 500 company, turned executive coach, and this is the Visibility Factor podcast, where we explore how to raise your visibility and play bigger at work and in life. We'll explore key topics and welcome guests that help you shift your thinking about yourself so you can see new possibilities for your leadership. I'm on a mission to create a visibility movement for leaders to show their value and be seen for their true talent. Are you ready to take the next step towards a higher level of visibility for yourself? Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Visibility Factor podcast. This is Sue Barber, your host. Today, we're going to talk about asking the right questions. Now, as a coach, I have seen how powerful questions can make a difference in helping a client shift their perspective about a situation or even themselves. And today's episode is going to be focused a little bit differently than that, though. I want to focus on helping you understand the importance of asking the right questions as a leader, whether that be in a meeting, in a one-on-one, in a presentation, whatever you're in, you can use questions to really drive different conversations. So let me share with you how you can use questions. I've got some different scenarios, and I want you to think about for you where you could possibly start inserting powerful questions into these situations. So the first one is, you can ask a hard question to bring up a situation that needs to be discussed. Let's say you're in a meeting and you know that you need to talk about this, but nobody seems to have it on the agenda. Nobody brings it up. And so you're the one who has to do that. And you can ask a hard question, something like, hey, have we ever come to a final decision on blah, blah, blah project? It can be a good conversation starter that either people say, yes, we should talk about that, or no, we need to schedule another meeting. Anyway that you do it, it gets it out there. Another one is you can give the spotlight to someone else by asking them a question so that they can share their perspective in front of other people. It's a great way to get visibility for that person. You can give your team a chance to shine by talking to them about where they're at on their project and getting them to share their perspective about how things are going, and maybe even give an opportunity to come to an agreement with the group if they need that. You can also start a brainstorming conversation. You can say, hey, we're having a problem with this situation. What are your ideas for us to address it? But sometimes just that really good, powerful question can get people thinking. You can also challenge assumptions that everyone is believing to be true with a question. You can say, is that really true? A very simple question to use, but sometimes it's just enough to get people thinking and questioning whether those assumptions are right. You can challenge the current state of a program or project to see if it should continue. It's something that you always have to do, especially if the program or project is a little off track. You want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. And then another one is deciding if funding should be approved. So as the person who approves that funding, you have to be the one to be very comfortable with whatever's happening. And that is the way to do it, by asking some good, hard questions of the people who are leading the program so that you feel comfortable. Great leaders ask great questions. They just do. So when you're in a meeting, pay attention to the questions that your senior leaders are asking and see if there's some things that maybe you could adapt for yourself and start using questions that are similar, obviously changing it to sound like you and your style. But it's a way for you to start to think more strategically and recognize the power of questions. So why do senior leaders ask all these questions? Have you ever paid attention to why they do it? Well, part of the reason they do it is because they cannot be in every meeting and know all the details. And so they have to ask questions in order to understand where things really stand. Now, that doesn't mean they don't know anything about the project or program. It just means that they haven't been in maybe the latest and greatest conversations, or they don't know all the agreements or challenges that you're facing. And so there's an opportunity for them to ask questions so that they feel like they're back up to speed. And questions are a great way to do that. They'll also ask questions to understand where things are and how people are thinking about a topic. When a leader asks a question, sometimes they will not say anything else about their own opinion about the topic. And the reason they do that is so that they can drive conversation for the rest of the group. And good leaders do that because they know if they insert their opinion or where they think things should go, that shuts the conversation down. I mean, think about if you've ever had a leader who says, hey, let's talk about this, and then they proceed to tell you exactly what they think you should do or they should do. you're not going to say anything, right? Because you know it's not going to really matter. That conversation's kind of mute at that point. It's just, let's go with whatever you just said, because why should we waste our time? So great leaders hold back, right? They put the question out there, but they don't necessarily give what they're thinking. They want to capture that from everyone else, which allows much better engagement, empowerment. Everybody comes along for the journey and they have a stake in it, right? When they come up with ideas, they have a stake in what this could look like and how it could work. And the more you do that, the more engagement you'll drive with the organization and your team. So I wanted to share some things from an article that Dave Bailey wrote called The Art of Asking Powerful Questions. So I'm going to share with you the 5 different types of questions that were in his article. But first, he also quoted Voltaire, and I thought this was a great quote. Judge a man by his questions rather than his answers. So if you think about that, if you're the person who asks the most powerful questions in the room, it really shows thought leadership. It shows that you're being strategic and thinking about things in a bigger way. So using questions is a really great strategy to get people to start to see the influence that you have or that you're trying to drive in conversations. So let's go through these different types of questions. The first type is open versus closed questions. Now, closed questions are very simple yes or no answers. If I ask you, are you okay? You probably say yes or no. An open question allows the person to share a whole lot more information. So if I asked you a question, how was your day? You're going to elaborate on what happened during your day. So you get more information. Leading versus curious questions. So leading questions push someone towards giving an answer that you might want or expect. And you might see this in legal shows where they show the courtroom scene and the opposing attorney says leading question. That is where someone is actually saying something like, don't you think it would be better to blah, blah, blah. And they're leading them down the path of where they want them to go. Curious questions on the other side are a coach's favorite kind of question, by the way. They're open and allow the person to see how they see things. So I might say something like, I'm curious, do you see any other options you could take in this situation? It's a way to drive the person to think about it differently and to come up with other options than they may have thought of before. Complex versus simple questions. Anytime you've ever heard a question that keeps going on and you kind of lose sight of the question, that is a complex question that it makes it really hard for people to follow. I prefer simple questions whenever possible because otherwise the person will forget. So I'll give you an example of a complex one. Can you tell me about a time when you had a meeting that didn't go well? It would be really great if you could share all the details about what was in the meeting, who was in the meeting, what they said, how they behaved, and what the outcome was. Now, by the time I finish, you have no idea when I'm going to finish, and you forgot what I originally even asked. Sometimes that can happen. So you have to maybe pause the person and say, hey, can we just pause for a second so I can answer the first question that you asked me? Something like that will just allow them to recognize that they may be going on and on without realizing it. The second one could be like a simple question. So that might be, can you say more about what led you to that decision? And that's a very open-ended question again, but it allows someone to actually answer it very quickly. Informational versus reflective questions. So a question that's trying to gain more information, and a reflective question is one that makes you think, makes you pause and reflect on something that just happened. So informational question might be, what happened in the meeting? A reflective question, what was your biggest takeaway from the situation? So using these different types of questions drives conversation that you can then learn more information about. Why versus what and how? So whenever I talk to clients about feedback, I'm very mindful of helping them understand the difference between these. Why questions create defensiveness in another person. So you might say something like, why did you make that decision? Why did you do that in the meeting yesterday? Well, that immediately causes that person to feel defensive versus using what and how questions, which opens up the conversation. What was that experience like for you? How did you feel when you went through that experience? Those questions allow the person to really just feel it in a neutral way. They don't feel defensive. They're more open to sharing. Now we're going to go through a couple great questions from an author, Michael Bungay Stanier, who wrote the book, The Coaching Habit. Now he has 7 types of questions in his book, but I'm going to pick my favorite 2. And the first one is the strategic question. If you say yes to this, What must you say no to? So it's thinking about boundaries and understanding that you're making a decision that may be the right one for this moment, but is it causing you to let go of other things, or other things might get in the way, or things you might miss out on? So it's a really powerful question to ask. And the second one I like is the learning question. What was most useful or most valuable here for you? And it allows the person to really reflect on what they experienced, and they can share that back with you. And it could create a great conversation to go through and understand what they're thinking and how they feel. So thinking about the ways that you can ask questions can be very helpful to your visibility. I have a bunch of different questions in the book, throughout the book, and then also in the appendix. And I put those there because I think sometimes we hesitate because we can't come up with the best question in that moment. And I wanted people to have a starting point so they can take any of these questions, turn them into their specific situations, and be able to leverage them. So these questions, think about, your industry, your culture, your project, whatever you're talking about, just insert it where it needs to go. But questions that are very open-ended, like, what does success look like? How are we going to measure it? What are the risks? Is there a mitigation plan in place to deal with them? What are alternatives that were considered? How does this compare to what's happening in the industry? What are our competitors doing in this space? And then simple questions about project stuff like, what is the communication plan? What's your approach for implementation? What's your action plan to get back on track? Can you see how these questions are very short and sweet, and they allow the person to really give a lot more information and detail? These types of questions might be questions that you might hear from senior leadership, short and sweet, but they're trying to get to a sense of, where are we? How are things going? Some other ones are, what is the feedback from the rest of the team? How does this align with our goals and strategies? What is your responsibility in this situation, though, is one of the best questions I think you can ask. And I ask it a lot as a coach because sometimes we have blind spots about certain situations that have happened, or maybe a disagreement or a difficult conversation. And we tend to blame the other person. And sometimes asking this kind of question, if you're a leader of a team and two team members aren't getting along, it's a really great question to ask. What is your responsibility in this situation? Because no situation is just all on one person. There is usually something that could be done differently. So taking the time to really make the person reflect if they had some responsibility helps them learn what to do differently next time. And then the easiest one ever, can you say more about that? So if someone has asked something and shared information and you still don't feel like you got to the crux of what's happened, you can say, can you say more about that? And then they keep going, and then you learn more information. So those are just some examples. There's many more in the book, but I think it's really helpful to start leveraging these kinds of questions wherever possible. Questions are important for leaders to use on a regular basis for all of these reasons that I've just outlined, but also to assess where the company is and if there's changes that need to be made. So questioning the status quo about how things are going, challenging the current state, allows for changes and improvements to happen so that the company continues to grow and develop and make a bigger impact as an organization. So it's important to do this in meetings and conversations that you're having, but it's also important to be mindful of, how is it impacting the business? Are you doing the right things for the business? And whether or not you can change those immediately or for the long term, at least you're starting to look at it and not just assuming that status quo is okay. So let's move into the visibility action plan for today. I would love you to capture 3 to 5 questions, any of these questions that I've shared today, or maybe you have your own, but start to think about how you can leverage questions in meetings in a bigger way. If you want to use any of these and modify them, feel free to do so, but also start listening to the questions that your leaders are using and write some of them down. Start to grab those questions and turn them into your own style with your own way of saying it. And it really starts to help people see that you're being more strategic and you're starting to think bigger about things. These are opportunities for you to get your thought leadership and your voice out there in the world in a bigger way. Thanks so much for joining today on the Visibility Factor podcast, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much for listening to the Visibility Factor podcast. Remember that visibility starts with small steps that are intentional and consistent each day. Be bold, be visible, be the leader you were meant to be. Find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Follow us on all of our social media platforms, which are highlighted in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Visibility Factor Podcast.